Mr. President, I rise today to stop the unnecessary and devastating consequences that will result from a ban on TikTok in the United States. In a few moments, I will ask unanimous consent that the Senate pass my legislation with Senator Wyden and Senator Booker to extend the TikTok Deadline Act, to extend the deadline by which ByteDance, TikTok's parent company, must sell TikTok or face a ban in 270 days. This simple one-sentence bill would avoid significant harm for TikTok's creators who depend upon the app to make a living, to find community, to share resources during emergencies such as the Los Angeles wildfires, and to discuss everything from the latest pop culture trends to controversial political topics. It is the home to 170 million American users. 170 million American users, that's over half of the US population and 65% of the United States adult population. It is 50% higher than the number of Americans who watch the Super Bowl. Those 170 million Americans will be devastated by a TikTok ban. Many make their living on the app and could face difficulties paying for groceries, rent, or medical care. Others may lose contact with a crucial support system, leaving them isolated and scared. If you don't believe me, then I encourage my colleagues to view the thousands of videos posted by TikTok users over the past few days, explaining why TikTok is so important to them. And these testimonials are powerful evidence about TikTok's economic, social, and cultural importance. And I implore my colleagues to listen to these users. Now, supporters of the TikTok ban will claim that any delay will threaten national security and allow China to supposedly indoctrinate the youth with anti-American views. First, I stand behind no lawmaker here in my commitment to protecting children online. I am the original author of the only federal online protection for children today, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. And I've authored legislation to update and modernize those protections. My Children and Teens Online Privacy Protection Act, to lift it up to age 16. That was blocked here on the Senate floor just 1 month ago. In December, we had it out of the committee. We could not get it passed. And I've repeatedly sent letters to the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice urging them to investigate and impose penalties on TikTok for putting their younger users at risk. When TikTok violates the law and puts its users at risk, I will call them out and I will demand accountability. In fact, the Federal Trade Commission has fined TikTok for violation of my law. So obviously, I'm concerned, but I'm also concerned about what American social companies do to teenagers. They do the same thing. I'm very concerned about what they do to young children. According to the Surgeon General, we have a mental health crisis in our country, pointing the finger at social media. Not one company, all the companies that are targeting teenagers and children in our country. As for the national security arguments, I recognize that ByteDance's ownership of TikTok poses security risks. I do not want China to have significant influence over an important communications channel in the United States and access to Americans' data. But Congress must appropriately balance those risks with the serious hardship imposed on TikTok's 170 million American users and the unintended consequences of a nationwide TikTok ban. With the impending TikTok ban, Congress has gotten that balance wrong. And most importantly, the proponents of the ban have repeatedly argued that TikTok is, quote, brainwashing Americans, but these claims are, at best, just speculation. At worst, they are a disguised effort to target American speech. So don't take it from me. In an affidavit in the D.C. District of Columbia Circuit, a senior intelligence officer stated that the government has, quote, no information that China coerced ByteDance to covertly manipulate content to TikTok. That's coming from our own government. That alone should make us pause. This is in the D.C. Circuit Court. They're not lying to a circuit court. So they don't have any information with regard to that accusation. Even worse, rather than addressing China's supposed influence over a key communications channel, the TikTok ban appears to be driving users to alternative Chinese applications, which we know even less about. In fact, on Monday, RedNote, a Chinese social media app, became the #1 most downloaded app on the Apple App Store. Is that the outcome that the law supporters were seeking or thought about? The TikTok ban not only threatens to shut down a platform critical for 170 million Americans, but also 7 million American businesses use TikTok. They use it as part of their business. All of that will shut down on Sunday, 4 days from now, just shut down. 7 million businesses who use it. And it's taking effect at least in parts of America, at the single worst period of time. A moment when TikTok creators in Los Angeles are using the app to share their stories and find resources during the tragic wildfires. A moment when a new president is set to take office with different views on the ban. President-elect Trump is asking for a pause right now. Ask the Supreme Court of the United States for a pause. Donald Trump. A moment when the Supreme Court is still considering the case. Hasn't even rendered a decision yet. A moment when the first official bid for TikTok was just submitted last week. It's time for Congress to acknowledge that the rushed passage of this law was a mistake. There were no hearings in the Senate. There were no witnesses in the Senate. No one got to hear anything about this ban because they put it into the bill that was going to provide military aid for Ukraine, for Israel, humanitarian aid. And they just stuck the TikTok ban into the legislation over in the House of Representatives to send it over here. We never had a hearing. We never had any consideration. And it's time for Congress to acknowledge that the rushed passage of this law was a mistake, that we need more time to let the courts and outside parties consider this issue. We need to do a better job of understanding the importance of the TikTok community and the impact of a TikTok ban. And that's why I introduced the Extend the TikTok Deadline Act. This bill does not repeal the underlying act. It simply gives TikTok, Congress, the people here in the Senate, parties that might want to buy TikTok, the incoming Trump administration, he himself is asking for an extension, and outside stakeholders additional time to get this right. We need time. We need time to figure this out. The court process is still going on for something that started last April. That would never have been expected to have occurred. We don't have any certainty as to the outcome, one way or the other. If this had happened in September, October, and November, out of the courts, we could have then deliberated before the deadline, this on Sunday, 4 days from now. But it didn't happen that way. So to the millions of creatives who have bravely shared their stories and explained why TikTok is important to them, I hear you. I am listening. And I encourage my colleagues to listen as well and to give a short reprieve to TikTok's death sentence. TikTok is far too important to let it die like this on Sunday without having given the extra time which is needed. Time for President-elect Trump, time for everyone to think about what an alternative pathway could be to letting TikTok die. And Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of S-103, introduced earlier today, and further that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there an objection? Senator from Arkansas.
Reserving the right to object, which I most certainly do, TikTok isn't just another social media platform. TikTok is a Chinese communist spy app that addicts our kids, harvests their data, targets them with harmful and manipulative content, and spreads communist propaganda. Congress recognized the unique dangers of TikTok when we voted on a massive bipartisan basis last April to give its Chinese communist-influenced parent company, ByteDance, 270 days to sell TikTok to an American buyer or to be shut down in America. That deadline is Sunday. What's more, ByteDance and TikTok had plenty of additional warning for years about the possibility of such action, long before Congress set this firm Sunday deadline. The Trump administration in 2020 attempted to shut down TikTok. So there was no rush, as the senator from Massachusetts asserted. We didn't pull the rug out from under TikTok, and we didn't ban it. Instead, Congress simply demanded that the app could no longer be owned and controlled by our nation's worst enemy, communist China. In other words, TikTok's owners had plenty of time to find a buyer, and there were plenty of willing buyers as well. Instead, TikTok whined, lied, complained, sued, and lobbied. Oh, how they lobbied. One notable lobbyist told me that he was offered $100,000 a month to represent TikTok, but he refused because TikTok is a sewer of vile anti-Semitism. Good for him. Unfortunately, I can't say that for the army of lawyers and lobbyists who saddled up on behalf of communist China. They know who they are. They should be ashamed of themselves. And they should know that I, for one, won't forget it. So let me be crystal clear. There will be no extensions, no concessions, and no compromises for TikTok. ByteDance and the Chinese communists had plenty of time to make a deal. In fact, the legislation allows the president to grant a 90-day extension to the Sunday deadline, though only if negotiations have substantially advanced, and the sale could likely close in 90 days. Neither is true today, so I expect President Biden will not grant the extension. And what President Biden cannot do under current law, this Congress, this Republican Congress, certainly won't do by changing the law. Not over my objection, in any case. And isn't it telling that ByteDance says communist China blocked the sale of TikTok for these last 9 months? What exactly does that tell us? Exactly what I said earlier. TikTok is a Chinese communist spy app. Consider one reason why the bill passed with such a huge bipartisan vote in April, namely the backlash against TikTok for its deranged lobbying campaign against the bill. As the bill was being considered by a House committee, TikTok sent push notifications to its users, demanding that they call into Congress and express opposition to the bill. Now, this wasn't a case of American citizens spontaneously rising up to exercise their First Amendment rights, but rather a foreign power egging them on, meddling in our politics, influencing our legislative debates. And what happened? Thousands of kids, called into congressional offices, some threatening to kill themselves or to assassinate members of Congress. No foreign adversary should have that kind of power over our politics or our children. Imagine how Chinese communists would use TikTok to influence our political debates during, say, a moment of heightened tensions over Taiwan. And let's examine a little more closely just what TikTok does to our country. Just last week, renowned social psychologist Jonathan Haidt wrote that TikTok is harming children on an industrial scale. China's version of TikTok promotes math, science, and learning, basically telling Chinese kids to do their homework and eat their vegetables and respect their elders, especially Chairman Xi, the Chinese dictator. In America, by contrast, TikTok promotes violence, obscenity, eating disorders, drug use, and even suicide. Internal company documents even revealed that content promoting pedophilia has long flowed right past TikTok's supposed moderators. Without question, TikTok's lethal algorithm has cost the lives of many American kids. China also uses TikTok to amplify its propaganda and suppress information critical of the communist tyranny in Beijing. Compared to other platforms, TikTok suppresses content related to China's genocide against the Uyghur people, Tibet, Taiwan, the South China Sea, Hong Kong, Tiananmen Square, and the origins of COVID, among other topics. TikTok also meddles in the politics of other countries by amplifying divisive content in, for instance, Israel, India, and, of course, America. And don't forget that TikTok harvests a vast trove of user data, including name, age, email, address, phone number, credit card number, facial features, voice prints, keystrokes, photos, videos, and viewing habits. This data can make users susceptible to manipulation and even blackmail, not only today, but also years from now when users may have become influential persons in the military, the intelligence community, business, media, and other walks of life. We're sometimes assured that TikTok has taken security measures to prevent Chinese communists from accessing this data of American citizens. But according to whistleblower testimony and internal company materials, these protections are about as airtight as a screen door. So the end is coming for Chinese communist-controlled TikTok. Perhaps the sale can be closed by Sunday, though I seriously doubt it. Even so, that sale would have to pass legal review and guarantee that China retains no residual influence at the company or through its algorithm. No residual influence whatsoever. But one way or the other, communist China will no longer exert this massive influence over our nation and our kids. I'll now yield to Senator Ricketts.
Mr. President,
Senator from Nebraska.
reserving the right to object. The Chinese Communist Party is our chief foreign adversary in the world and the only external existential threat to our nation. They threaten our freedom, our prosperity, our security, and our very way of life. When I was governor of Nebraska, I was the first governor to ban TikTok on state devices because of the threat it posed. Why did I do that? Well, because Xi Jinping said that he wants to replace us as the world leader. Dictators tend to say what they're going to do and try and do it. We should take him seriously. TikTok is one of the ways that he is trying to do it, trying to undermine what we do around the world. The Chinese Communist Party wants to replace us. TikTok is one of the ways they are trying to influence our downfall. As many as 150 million Americans use TikTok. 52% of them say they regularly get news through TikTok. And we know that the CCP uses TikTok to slant the news. This is part of their propaganda. Data shows, for example, my esteemed colleague from Arkansas referenced it, the anti-Semitism on TikTok. If you go back and look, you can see 50 times the posts on pro-Hamas, pro-Palestinian content, 50 times the views, despite the fact that overwhelmingly Americans support Israel. The polling shows it. And that's just one of the issues that they get involved with. We wouldn't allow any foreign adversary to own enough TV stations, radio stations, or newspapers to reach 150 million Americans. Why are we allowing our chief adversary in the world, one that seeks our downfall, to have that kind of access? It makes absolutely no sense. And of course, the Chinese Communist Party has no free rights in America. Those belong to American citizens. We need to make sure we take a step against this. And last April we did. Overwhelmingly, bipartisan, bicameral, because this Congress saw the threat that TikTok poses by the Chinese Communist Party being able to influence ByteDance, because they have to. ByteDance is a Chinese company, has to do whatever the Chinese Communist Party says. That's their law. They have to do what the Chinese Communist Party says. So therefore, they push the propaganda, and as my colleague from Arkansas pointed out, they spy on Americans, collect data on Americans. And so we saw a bipartisan effort, over 350 votes in the House to pass this bill. And by the way, the same bipartisan support here in the Senate, passing 79 to 18. The law gathered so much bipartisan, bicameral support because we recognized this was about keeping America and Americans safe. That ByteDance needed to divest TikTok so that we could be assured that the Chinese Communist Party wasn't pushing its propaganda or spying on us. We acted with a conviction against that threat, and of course, we know from our classified briefings what that threat for TikTok was. And this threat is not something far off or imagined. We have seen TikTok's interference in elections elsewhere around the world, most recently in Romania. The European Commission just opened an investigation into TikTok's failure to limit election interference in Romania's election, and that has caused all sorts of disruption in that country. India has banned TikTok for the very same reason that they are seeing the push of Chinese propaganda that slants on their news media the same way we see it here in America. Albania, worried about Romania, banned TikTok. We passed a law that did not ban TikTok. We passed a law that said you have to have an American owner like, I don't know, radio stations, TV stations, newspapers. The senator from Massachusetts would like to give us a 270-day extension. What's going to be different? What is going to be different? ByteDance has had 270 days. And rather than making legitimate attempts to find a buyer, and by the way, you all recall the news stories, when this law was being discussed and being passed, there were a number of Americans who said they'd be interested in buying them. ByteDance didn't do anything. Rather than looking for an American buyer, they decided to hire an army of lobbyists and lawyers to try and subvert the will of the Congress. They spent the last 270 days trying to avoid being sold. As my colleague said, the Chinese Communist Party will not let them be sold. That in and of itself should tell you everything you need to know about this. If the Chinese Communist Party is refusing ByteDance to sell TikTok to an American buyer, you know they are using it to push their propaganda and to collect data on us. They don't want those algorithms coming to America because then they'll be exposed. That's what this is about. This is a national security threat. That's why we took action last April. They've had these 270 days. They did nothing with them. To extend it would mean nothing as well, except give the Chinese Communist Party another 270 days to push their propaganda and to spy on more Americans. Finally, Today, in our Foreign Relations Committee hearing, we had the confirmation hearing for Senator Rubio, who's being nominated for Secretary of State. I asked him in his confirmation hearing earlier today, why average Americans in Nebraska should care about the threat the Chinese Communist Party poses to our way of life. And he had a great response, and I want to read it here. He said, "If we stay on the road we're on right now, in less than 10 years, virtually everything that matters to us in life will depend on whether China will allow us to have it or not." Folks, this is a clear test of whether America is willing to get off that road. Are we willing to change direction? Are we willing to say to the Chinese Communist Party, enough, no further, not now? We are changing, we are getting away from the bad practices of the past that the Chinese Communist Party has taken advantage of. Let's send a clear signal to Beijing that Americans' national security is going to take a priority. Let's stand strong. Let's remember we passed this law for a reason, and it's to keep Americans safe. And therefore, I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I am disappointed that my colleagues have objected to this simple legislation. I recognize the national security risks here, but the fear-mongering about the supposed anti-American content on TikTok is the exact type of government overreach that has left tens of millions of Americans furious. The hyperbolic statements made by my colleagues are especially concerning, given that the intelligence community itself has acknowledged that it has no information that China is covertly manipulating content on TikTok. No information. Let me say that again. In the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, the government was asked to present evidence that ByteDance was covertly manipulating content on TikTok for the benefit of the Chinese government. And the intelligence community submitted an affidavit saying that the government has no information that it is being manipulated. So as we're out here today, by the way, that would change the whole debate. If they had information, we'd be having a different debate. If there was proof that they were manipulating, provided by the intelligence community, we'd be having a different debate. They don't have any information. And I sat in the same intelligence briefings that my colleagues did, and I kept waiting to hear that information. I never heard it. I don't think it's given up secrets to say I didn't hear any secrets. I didn't hear them because there weren't any. And they made that filing in the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. They have no information. And I've read the reports and news articles. I've tracked the court case closely. I'm clear-eyed about the rest, but unlike many of my colleagues, I am also clear-eyed about the profound economic, political, and social importance of TikTok to 170 million users and 7 million businesses in the United States. And I understand how many creators depend on TikTok to find community, share their story, find resources. So my ask again here is simple. 270 days. And we can try to find a resolution of this issue that doesn't have a draconian cutoff on Sunday afternoon. So this is the issue that we're confronted with at this point. We don't have the evidence that is being cited by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. It doesn't exist. They may believe it, but they don't have the evidence to present to this body because the intelligence community has not provided it to them. Otherwise, again, as I'm saying, we would have a very different debate. And this is a very important issue because the Supreme Court just had a hearing. It's unbelievable that it's 9 months later on the constitutionality of your ban. So I think that the colleagues of mine who spoke on the other side, they're saying, well, they should have already sold it. Well, they took it to court to find out if this law is constitutional. They have a right to do that. They have a right to go to the Supreme Court. They have a right to have a hearing. They have a right to make their case. They have a right to say that it's unconstitutional. It hasn't been ruled on yet. It hasn't been ruled on. And so because of that, all I'm asking for is more time. Listen to Donald Trump. He's saying, give it more time. That's all I'm asking for. And I will say as well, when my friend cites suicides, other incredible consequences of social media in our society, I do agree with him 100%. But it's not just TikTok. It's Instagram. It's Facebook. It's company after company after company that's targeting 14-year-old girls with bulimia, with anorexia, with information that's making them even sicker and sicker and sicker. That's why when my bill was killed here in December to pass a law which said that parents can just say, erase all that information you're gathering about my daughter, and it's the third Congress in a row that it happened, yeah, TikTok should be stopped. And so shouldn't Facebook, and so shouldn't Instagram, so shouldn't all of them. But just don't raise it in a TikTok context. Raise it as well in a Senate context. That law should have passed. That should have been already on the president's desk. And it was bipartisan. It was bipartisan. You want to talk about lobbyists. You want to talk about stopping legislation, okay? So I agree with the gentleman on the fundamental fact that TikTok is a contributor to this problem. But it's part of a larger problem. And I also want to make the point that there's no imminent threat of a compromise of this information that we're talking about here today, because the intelligence community does not, in fact, have the information to say that that is accurate. So I agree with Donald Trump. Give it more time. Allow for the process to play out. Allow for the Supreme Court to make a decision. Allow for potential buyers to step forth. Allow for the users of TikTok, the 7 million businesses to use it, that use it for their own families. Allow for the families in the fire zone in LA to continue to use it to build community, to run their small businesses, and not cut it off on Sunday. And that is what I have been asking the Senate to do. So I regret that the objection has been raised by my colleagues, but I tell you, there's going to be real harm. And my hope is that I can partner with President-elect Trump to try to find a resolution of this issue so that we do it with the information that right now we do not have to take such an action. So with that, Mr. President, I yield back.
President.
Senator from Arkansas.
I want to respond briefly to a few points of my friend from Massachusetts, and he is my friend. I want to make an underline, first off, in the record, because this is a notable day. Direct quotes from the senator from Massachusetts: listen to Donald Trump, and I agree with Donald Trump. Underline that in the record. I'm not sure you're going to see that again for the next 4 years. But more importantly, on this issue, the senator is correct that TikTok is not alone in causing harms for American kids. I agree with them. Other apps can result in eating disorders or depression or mental illness. I voted for his legislation in December. I have my own online safety legislation. The difference is that TikTok is influenced and controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. And this bill did not just address TikTok. It addressed all foreign adversary-owned apps. He raised the question of Red Note. Well, guess what? If TikTok users flood to Red Note, they're going to face the same challenge there because it's also controlled by the Communist Party. Second, The senator's made a lot about some affidavit by some intelligence community official in some case. I don't know what it's referring to. I do know this. I've been on the Intelligence Committee for 10 years. I chair it now. I've heard the testimony of senior leaders that TikTok poses a grave threat to our national security and our people's well-being. But also know this. Third, you don't need intelligence. TikTok's own internal documents reveal the threat that it poses to Americans. The state attorneys generals have brought lawsuits to defend their people. Those lawsuits have produced documents that show chapter and verse exactly what TikTok has done to Americans. And finally, we keep hearing it's only 270 days. It's only 270 days. In 270 days, that is what TikTok will say again, because it will not have been sold, because Chinese communists won't allow it to be sold, because it's not just another app. It's not Instagram or Facebook or X or anything else. It is a Chinese communist spy app. I yield the floor.
Senator from Nebraska.
Again, I just want to briefly build upon my colleague from Arkansas. 2 quick points. One, our colleague from Massachusetts has called this a TikTok ban. That's inaccurate. The law that was passed was, as my colleague pointed out, about foreign adversaries and required TikTok to be sold to an American owner. If it had been sold, TikTok could continue to be in operation. And my understanding is, even if it is forced to close down because it hasn't sold by Sunday, if it is sold in the future, it will be able to reestablish operations as long as it's to an American buyer. So it's not a ban. The reason it's a ban is because TikTok and the Chinese Communist Party chose to make it a ban. ByteDance has not tried to parallel path this, to my colleague from Massachusetts' point. They could have been trying to sell it at the same time they're going through the court and had that ready. In fact, they could have written a document saying, I'm only going to sell if the Supreme Court says I have to. They could have found a buyer and written a contract that way. Absolutely. They didn't have to make this a ban. And with regard to my colleague from Massachusetts' other point, I did offer a proof point based upon data here in the United States about how TikTok pushes a Chinese Communist Party agenda to push their propaganda. In this case, it was anti-Semitism against Israel by promoting pro-Hamas, a terrorist group's posts, its posts, and then pro-Palestinian posts versus Israeli, pro-Israel ones. So I gave data there, but this is exactly the kind of same pushing of propaganda which has led, I presume, India to ban TikTok as well, because the Chinese Communist Party is doing the same thing to them. So a couple of points on this, and again, I don't think anything would be different in 270 days from now, because the Chinese Communist Party will not allow TikTok to be sold because their algorithm would be exposed. With that, I would just end on saying China must be deterred. Mr. President, I yield.